Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Next, the brother of a private detective found murdered 30 years ago has written to the Prime Minister, Theresa May, asking her not to drop plans to investigate the relationship between the police and the press. We'll talk to Alistair Morgan in a moment. But first, here's his brother's story. It's one of the biggest unsolved murders in British history. Daniel Morgan was a private detective working in London. 30 years ago, in 1987, he was found dead in a pub car park in Sydenham in southeast London. He'd been struck 3 times with an axe in the back of the head. His Rolex had been stolen. There was £1,000, though, in his jacket pocket. Southern Investigations, the company Daniel Morgan set up with his business partner Jonathan Rees, was thought to be working with the police and News of the World journalists. It's thought that Mr Morgan was ready to expose corruption at Scotland Yard. Despite 5 police investigations, no one has been successfully prosecuted or convicted. The family wanted an independent inquiry. They fear a corrupt police officer may be connected to Daniel Morgan's death. As Home Secretary, Theresa May was the only minister in 25 years to respond to Mr Morgan's family. In 2013, she set up an expert panel investigating the role of corrupt police and their relationships with journalists and private detectives. But Daniel's brother Alistair Morgan says its work has been delayed due to what he called a lack of full cooperation by the police. The Metropolitan Police said this was an exceptionally complex process and they were working closely with the panel. The case remains unsolved. Well, Daniel Morgan's brother Alistair, who is here, believes police corruption prevented Scotland Yard from ever finding his brother's murderer. He's calling on Theresa May not to drop so-called Leveson 2. Alongside Alistair Morgan is Professor Tim Lockhurst, who's Professor of Journalism at the University of Kent, and he doesn't believe there's any need for a Leveson 2. Both got very different reasons for your views. Alistair Morgan, the government is currently weighing this up, whether to go ahead. Why do you say Theresa May should go ahead?
Well, we have this panel of inquiry looking into my brother's murder, and when I accepted this proposal from the Home Secretary that this should be looked into in this way, I had in the back of my mind the firm idea that Leveson 2 was going to take place. And because a panel does not have statutory powers, it can't subpoena witnesses, it can't order them to give evidence or disclose papers or anything like that. I thought that if there were areas that the panel could not deal with because they didn't have the powers, then Leveson 2 would be available afterwards as a kind of backstop, if you like, for this.
Right, OK. And is that, bearing in mind the cost of a potential Leveson 2 running into the millions, is that the right way forward to try to find out what happened to your brother?
Well, I mean, I think that as I said, it's a backstop. If the panel can't get answers to certain very important questions, then this would be a means of doing that. I also think that Leveson 2, the issue of journalists and the police has not been dealt with fully by Leveson 1, and I know from my brother's case that there are definitely areas that need to be looked into there.
Professor Lockhurst, it would be worth reminding our audience what Leveson 2 is meant to be.
Well, it's about the regulation of the British press. It's a successor to Leveson 1. And of course, a large part of it is seeking to look into relationships in the past between British journalists and the police. That is an aspect which some people think is still worth pursuing. I would suggest it's in fact exploring the past. These relationships are all a very long time ago. There have been many inquiries into the conduct of the police since 1987, for example. The police have reformed their actions greatly. Journalists have reformed theirs too. I don't think there's any need whatsoever for Leveson 2 on that basis. But even more importantly, Leveson 1 has been a spectacular failure, and there is no public demand for any further expenditure on such an inquiry.
So there are no outstanding questions as far as you're concerned to do with the relationship between journalists and the police?
I think that the relationships between journalists and the police may in the past, on occasion, have thrown up allegations of corruption. The proper way to investigate those is through criminal prosecutions and through the courts. There are particular cases, which has happened,
yeah.
And most of those cases have actually turned out not to convict journalists, although in some cases they have convicted police officers. But that's the right way to do it. I'm not suggesting that there isn't some kind of problem or wasn't one in the past. It's a very minor problem. Let's remember the fundamental point. Journalists exist to find out things which powerful people don't want the public to know. And that means that journalists often do need to have police sources, that the work with police sources often reveals information which is dramatically in the public interest. That, after all, is what Operation Elvedon, the attempt to prosecute journalists, discovered. And we shouldn't do anything which cramps the journalist's ability to find out information.
So your worry is that Leveson 2 could potentially bring in further regulation of the press, and you say that would be a bad thing?
I've been a critic of the Leveson process from the very beginning. I think that it is an analogue inquiry in a digital era. I think that it has failed to win the support of any substantial British newspaper. It's always worth remembering that Leveson's proposals...
I mean, it's not surprising that it's failed to gain the support of any substantial British newspaper.
Well, it is surprising in one sense, isn't it, Victoria, because it was The Guardian that broke the story of phone hacking, The Guardian which campaigned year after year to bring about an inquiry, and The Guardian is amongst the newspapers which refuses to abide by the conclusions. Nobody from the left of the Guardian right through to the Daily Mail on the right believes that the proposals that Lord Leveson put forward are worth accepting.
Okay.
And I think that tells us something very interesting.
But is that your worry, that it could lead to further press regulation? And you
I
say
think
that's
that
not
it will
necessary?
cramp the power of newspapers to investigate in the public interest. I also think it's totally out of date in a generation where the biggest problem is how the internet treats news, and Leveson hasn't even looked at that.
Do you accept, Alistair Morgan, that as a result of the criminal prosecutions of various public officials, members of the police service and journalists, that actually the media and the police have made significant changes to the way they operate?
I don't really know about that, but what I am sure of is that they haven't really got to the bottom of this. Leveson 1 didn't get to the bottom of the relationship between the press and the police. I'm quite sure of that.
Do you think a Leveson 2 would?
Well, I think that the police have been seriously compromised at a very high level by their interaction with journalists in the past, and that this has not really been examined properly.
Okay. Well, we'll find out what Theresa May is going to do, whether she's going to proceed in the next few weeks. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
I've been getting away with it.